Hello everyone! Today I'm going to discuss how I made these custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder enemies and objects that were featured in my two latest custom levels. I suppose I should make this clear right away, none of these are fully custom actors in the way you may have seen in mods of older 2D Mario games. I'm not a programmer, so these weren't made from scratch. Still, I've gotten loads of questions about how these things were created, so without further ado, let me explain. These bouncy balloon platforms are edits of the triangle trampolines from the original game. The reason I specifically replaced those, as opposed to any other bouncy object, is because of these pre-programmed ripple animations. These were implemented by rigging the model of this platform with a number of bones, which each move differently depending on which animation gets played. So I modeled a simple balloon shape, which I rigged in roughly the same way, which is what allows the animations to be carried over. This vertical stripe pattern on the balloons was achieved using a normal map, which is a special kind of texture that can apply directional lighting to a surface depending on which color you're using. To oversimplify things a bit, the red channel is used to indicate to what extent every pixel is facing right, and the green channel shows how much each pixel faces upwards. So because of these red and green-ish stripes, the game renders the balloon as if its shape is more complicated than it really is. I kept the same semi-translucent material used by the original triangle platforms, though obviously I made the small balloons pink. These ropes that are holding the balloon together aren't actually a model at all. They're just a flat surface with a very simple texture applied, which is also how this gear in the middle of the triangle platforms works. The reason this isn't really noticeable in-game is once again because of a normal map, which in this case is used to apply all of the lighting of these ropes. Most people make normal maps like these by modeling a shape out in 3D and then making a render out of that. But in this case, I actually drew this normal map by hand because that seemed easier. Okay, so that's the visuals of the balloon covered, but how did I give this originally triangular platform circular collision? Well, every actor in Super Mario Bros. Wonder has a pack file, which is what stores basic information related to that actor, including the shape of its collision. So by opening up object triangle trampoline l.pack.zs, then in there the 5 folder, then the shape param folder, and then object triangle trampoline l_attack.5_shapeparam.bgyml, this text is actually what determines the shape of the collision of the triangle platform. The normal triangle platform is actually made up of 3 shapes like this to form a triangle, but our bouncy balloon only needs one simple circle shape. So I copied over the collision from this circular platform, changed some of these values to make the circle a bit bigger, and surprisingly, that worked. I am skipping over a lot of trial and error here, by the way, because I spent hours upon hours dealing with several problems I encountered along the way that I have no idea how to explain. But anyways, that's how I made these bouncy balloons. I was actually originally planning on making much bigger bouncy hot air balloons, but for some reason resizing these smaller balloons gets rid of that cool ripple animation, so that's why I ended up keeping them their original size. I also made these platforms specifically so they could hang from the balloons. These replaced the icy scaffold platforms used in Out My Way Valley in the original game, because those happen to be roughly the size I was looking for. Just like the ropes for the balloons, these platforms are completely 2D and hand-drawn, with a normal map to apply proper lighting. Even though this one is a bit more complicated, I still made this normal map by hand as well, since both platforms are mostly made up of pretty basic shapes. These platforms have a mix 0 texture, which is used to determine how shiny different parts of the texture should appear, and also to apply shadows. Now you might think that because these platforms are completely flat, they don't need any specific 3D modeling, but you'd be wrong. Most 2D assets in Wonder are placed onto specific 3D models that are like paper cutouts of the 2D art, which prevents any fuzzy, pixelated edges from showing up in-game. There are some exceptions to this. For example, I've always felt like these Spike statues looked a bit pixelated, and that's because these don't have a specific 3D cutout model. So if I wanted my platforms to look good, I needed to model cutouts of my own, which I did. Also, because the platforms I was replacing had icy collision, I needed to go into their collision parameters as well and change their collision type to wood. The final balloon related assets I wanted to make were these hot air balloons for in the background. I made these in 2D as well. In fact, they were extremely simple to make since background assets don't really need that much detail. I drew some simple shapes, made a normal map for lighting and a mix 0 texture because why not? Then I made a cutout model for the texture to be projected onto, and there we go. Alright, so those are all the objects I made for Sugar Star Summit, but now let's get into some more proper custom stuff by talking about the enemies and objects I made for Rrrumba Bumble. Back in my new Super Mario Bros. U modding days, I made a mod that featured these Stingbee-like enemies that were actually model replaced Cheep Cheeps. Well, they didn't technically replace Cheep Cheeps because those appear on the world map, so that would have looked really strange. Instead, they replaced Eep Cheeps and Deep Cheeps. In that mod, they were spiky because you can't jump on underwater enemies in New Super Mario Bros. U, but you can in Wonder, so I decided to give this idea another shot. I exported the Stingbee model from Super Mario 3D World and the Cheep Cheep model from Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and did my best to make the two line up, including rigging the Stingbee using the Cheep Cheep's bones. The fins of Cheep Cheeps flap horizontally, whereas the wings of Stingbees flap vertically. So since I had to keep the Cheep Cheep's normal animations, I was forced to rotate the Stingbee's wings. It doesn't really make any kind of sense for a flying creature's wings to move in this direction, but honestly I don't think most people will even notice the change. I also ended up deciding to copy over the eyes from the Cheep Cheeps model onto the Stingbee, since I was running into some problems with the animations where the enemy's eyes track the player's position. Alright, so far this just seems like a pretty typical model swap, so what makes this a custom enemy in a way that my previous model swaps weren't? Well, a couple of months ago, a person by the name of Thea MLY discovered a way to duplicate actors in Super Mario Bros. Wonder. So whereas normally swapping out an enemy's model means the original can't be used in the same mod, using this new method, it should be possible to have both normal Cheep Cheeps and Stingbees in the same mod. Remember those pack files I mentioned when talking about the collision of the balloons? It turns out that duplicating those, then renaming the file externally, and also renaming some specific stuff internally, makes the game act as if this duplicate is a brand new actor. There's also a giant list of all of the game's actors stored in these two files in the RSDB folder, so we could simply add a new entry with the correct file names of our duplicated actor, and this would actually make the game look for our newly created pack file. The Cheep Cheeps pack file is enemypukupuku.pack.zs, so I renamed my duplicate to enemyhatchin.pack.zs, since Hatchin is the Japanese name for Stingbees. I also made a renamed duplicate of the model file, and then changed which model file the pack file references, and finally after I added an enemy Hatchin entry into those two big lists, I could now place this brand new actor into the game. Once again, I am oversimplifying things a bunch here, because even though I wasn't the one who discovered this method, it still took me a long time to figure out the steps required to make this specific duplicate work. And there was still some troubleshooting required at this point. For example, when I killed my new Stingbee enemy, its body would slowly float down as if it was still underwater, which was obviously a remnant of it being a Cheep Cheep. So I had to look through all of the enemy's parameters until I found one that, when set to false, would get rid of this underwater gravity. There were two other problems I ran into that I couldn't fix. First of all, I would have loved to make the Stingbees like twice as fast. This slow movement makes sense for underwater enemies, but it's kind of ridiculous for Stingbees to fly this slowly. I did find a few different movement speed values I could mess with. However, these only seem to apply the changed speed to the Stingbee before it turns around. After that, it would revert to its default speed. I'm guessing that the game only looks at these values when the enemy is loaded in, and after that it uses the values stored in the enemy's code, which I have no idea how to modify. The second problem is something that applies to all duplicated enemies as far as I'm aware. Normally, when you jump on multiple enemies in a row, the game will reward you with these words that become more and more congratulatory until you get a 1-up. However, if you jump on multiple custom enemies in a row, the words don't change, it just keeps saying good. But this is a tiny thing, I doubt most people will even notice, so I don't think this is a deal breaker. Anyways, another semi-custom actor in my latest level is this giant Rrrumba. Although this is functionally just a remodel of the giant snowball, I didn't even see a need to duplicate the actor in this case, I still think the process of this guy's creation is worth discussing. A subtle thing I always enjoy about Mario enemy designs is when a bigger version of the same enemy has a different design that somehow emphasizes its size. An example of this in Super Mario Bros. Wonder is the giant Hoppycats, which aren't just the normal Hoppycat but bigger, but actually have this unique design that helps make them feel big. So I wanted to do the same thing with the Rrrumba. Normal Rrumbas have this strange stretched hexagonal prism shape, so for my giant Rrrumba I decided to try and find a similar but more complicated shape. I ended up settling on making it a truncated icosahedron shape, which consists of pentagons surrounded by hexagons. This is actually the same shape used for footballs, or soccer balls if you're American. So I modeled a couple different hexagons and pentagon shapes in the style of the original Rrrumba, and then started putting these together like puzzle pieces to form this shape. I also made a special pentagon for the Rrrumba's body to go into, so after a bit of work, my Rrrumba football was complete, at least when viewed from the front. Did I make this model so I could import it into the game? Nope. Just like the giant snowball, I decided to make my giant Rrrumba yet another 2D render. So I rendered a normal map and a diffuse map, and then I actually spent quite a lot of time making little improvements to these in 2D. For example, I wanted these dark edges to appear smooth in-game instead of jagged, so I manually replaced that part of the normal map with a sphere shape. I also never bothered giving the Rrrumba's model any detailed textures, so I had to add these hexagon patterns onto the 2D render. I made another one of these mix 0 textures, so I could make the Rrrumba shell more shiny than the rest of its body. Then I made another 2D cutout model, imported everything, and there we go. This thing definitely doesn't look perfect, but I think that comes down to the lack of animations and particles as opposed to my design work. I think the football shape is actually very fitting, and the whole thing looks completely normal alongside the smaller Rrrumba. One more actor duplicate I made for this level was these spikes actually. So in the original game, these orange spikes don't have collision on their own. They only damage the player in vanilla levels because the game has this invisible layer of hard-coded collision that we can't modify. Therefore, in order to give these spikes in my level collision, I duplicated a normal spikes object that does have proper collision, renamed it using the same method I described for the Stingbee, and then I changed the model it references to this orange spikes model. So that was supposed to be the last custom actor I would discuss in this video, but then in the middle of working on this level, I ran into a big problem. One of the main gimmicks I'd come up with for this level was to have Shovas push Rrumbas like this. The problem is, that. No matter how I set up the Shovas and Rrumbas, it seems unavoidable that a Rrrumba will eventually randomly kill the Shova so long as the Shova moves around. So I had three options. Either I try and probably fail to design around this problem, I remove Shovas from the level entirely, or I try to apply what we've learned so far to make a custom stationary Shova. I got kinda lucky because Shovas have this simple walk speed value that, when set to 0, makes the Shova stop in place. Except that actually wasn't lucky at all because the Shova still plays its walking animation when doing this. If I wanted this to look good, I'd need the Shova to have some sort of simple idle animation when standing still. Now, swapping out animations by exporting and re-importing them with Switch Toolbox is easy. So if the Shova had an idle animation where it stood still, I could have fixed this by swapping out its walking animation for that. But Shovas don't have any animations where they just stand still. So at this point, I was about ready to give up. See, I know that animation editing should technically be possible in this case by using Autodesk Maya or something like that, but I've tried that before and have never been able to figure it out. The only somewhat successful attempt at animation editing I've ever been able to pull off was for some unfinished Mario Kart 8 Deluxe projects from years ago, but that was using Track Studio, the Mario Kart 8 track editor. Switch Toolbox doesn't allow you to edit animations like these. So, only because I was extremely desperate, I tried exporting a Super Mario Bros. Wonder animation into this Mario Kart 8 tool, and to my surprise, that actually worked. Don't get me wrong, this was still a nightmare to work with. I had to turn one of the Shovas' other animations into a convincing looking idle animation, whilst only being able to manually drag around keyframes like this. The game would crash if I made the animation any longer than 28 frames, because that's how long the original walking animation is, and it also doesn't help that Wonder is famous for its expressive animations, so I couldn't just have the Shova stand completely still. But after a few attempts, I ended up making this simple animation where the Shova moves around ever so slightly, and I think it looks pretty decent. So after importing the animation, I duplicated the Shova actor, turning enemy Osukun into enemy Osukun stationary, and I also made this stationary Shova variant load a model with pink gloves to distinguish it from the normal Shova. I was so happy about how this guy turned out that I got pretty excited about the prospect of editing the animations of other custom enemies. So this made me go back to looking into rotating the Stingbies' wings to make them move up and down, but I quickly realized that would be a lot more complicated than one might expect. So for now, that's all I've done in terms of custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder actor creation and duplication. I'm definitely planning on doing more of this kind of stuff in the future, though this doesn't mean all of my levels are going to feature crazy custom enemies or objects from now on. If you have any suggestions for how I could turn existing enemies or objects into something new, please let me know by leaving a comment. And while you're down there, maybe also consider liking the video or subscribing or whatever. I also have a personal Discord server linked in the description alongside a link to the Wonderland Super Mario Bros. Wonder Modding Discord server. And if you'd like to watch my videos a few days early, maybe consider signing up for a channel membership. Anyways, thank you so much for watching and bye bye!